It all started with a simple tweet, but that tweet would end up unraveling a masterstroke of political strategy. Donald Trump, a man who had always played the media like a well-tuned piano, was about to execute a plan that no one, not even his fiercest critics, would see coming. It was a late Friday afternoon when Trump posted the tweet. The timing was deliberate, right before the weekend news cycle. The message was simple but loaded: the corrupt judges in this country are being exposed. They don't want the truth to come out, but the truth will come out. Watch. On its face, the tweet seemed like another one of his trademark bombastic claims, a flare fired in the midst of the ongoing legal battles he was facing. But those in the know, those who had followed his rise through the chaos of American politics, knew that this wasn't just an empty threat. Trump had been quietly gathering evidence for months, digging into the actions of certain judges who had, at best, turned a blind eye to his legal troubles, and at worst, had been actively obstructing his path to freedom. Corruption had seeped into the judiciary like poison into the bloodstream of the nation's legal system. And now, Trump had a plan to turn the tables. His allies, deep within the political underground, had been working tirelessly, digging up dirt on these judges. Secret files, phone records, shady financial transactions, nothing was too small. Trump had always known how to use the media to his advantage, but now he was about to use the courts against itself. By the time his tweet hit the media, the pieces of his trap were already in place. The judges, corrupt as they were, had no idea they were about to be exposed in a way that would make the Watergate scandal look like child's play. By Monday morning, the media had already picked up on Trump's cryptic tweet, spinning it into a frenzy of speculation. His words were dissected on every channel, in every newsroom, with everyone trying to figure out what truth he was referring to and who the corrupt judges might be. It was clear Trump had the media in the palm of his hand, but that was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, Trump's legal team had unleashed their plan. They strategically leaked information to investigative journalists and political insiders, knowing full well that the information would end up in the hands of the public. But this time, it wasn't just any leak. It was the kind of leak that would sow doubt, make people question everything, and send shockwaves through the judicial system. The first wave of the trap was the release of a single, innocuous-sounding report. It detailed an alleged meeting between a prominent judge and a high-ranking political figure who had long been associated with Trump's fiercest rivals. The report, though heavily redacted, hinted at the possibility of a quid pro quo arrangement, the judge allegedly receiving financial compensation for favorable rulings in politically sensitive cases. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to get the media buzzing. But the real genius of Trump's trap lay in how the media would run with the story. They would be forced to scrutinize the very judges who had been critical of him, giving him the opportunity to expose even more secrets. Trump knew that as soon as the first report hit, other outlets would be forced to dig deeper, following leads and trying to outdo each other in uncovering the so-called truth. And as the media descended upon the scandal like vultures, the judges, so accustomed to operating in the shadows, were now on the defensive. The very judges who had seen themselves as untouchable were now scrambling to protect their reputations. They began to distance themselves from each other, leaking counter-narratives, denying the accusations, and claiming they were victims of a political witch hunt. But the trap was set, and Trump's next move was already in motion. As the public's attention shifted to the revelations of corruption, Trump's team had prepared the next, much more explosive bombshell, one that would bring the entire judiciary under fire. The tension was palpable. The media's obsession with the corrupt judge story had only intensified. Every hour, new allegations surfaced, each one more scandalous than the last. Investigative reporters were on high alert, and the public was devouring every morsel of information, hungry for more. But no one had seen what was coming next. Trump, ever the strategist, had timed his next move perfectly. On a Tuesday morning, just as the media frenzy reached its peak, a bombshell dropped. The release was handled with the precision of a master manipulator. It wasn't just a leak, it was a full-blown, public unveiling. A detailed dossier of financial records, text messages, and encrypted emails between the corrupt judges and key political figures emerged. And it was all tied to one person, an infamous billionaire donor who had been a central player in some of the most controversial judicial confirmations of the decade. The dossier painted a vivid picture of a network of corruption that stretched deep into the heart of the judiciary, one that went far beyond the isolated incidents the public had initially suspected. It showed a pattern of decisions made by these judges that directly benefited the billionaire's interests, cases where rulings seemed deliberately tailored to protect powerful figures from prosecution or scrutiny. The documents were explosive, and it was clear that the extent of the corruption went far beyond anything the media had anticipated. But the most shocking part of the dossier was the revelation that some of these judges had been compromised even before they were appointed to the bench. There were payments, undisclosed meetings, and secret deals that had been carefully orchestrated to ensure these judges would rule in favor of the right people, at the right time. And Trump, ever the master of timing, had used the media's own sensationalism to his advantage, turning the spotlight on the very system that had once tried to bury him. The reaction from the judges was immediate and frantic. Some tried to dismiss the revelations as fabricated or a political smear campaign, but their denials only made them appear more guilty. Others desperately tried to claim they were blindsided by the information, but that too rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence. The public wasn't buying it. Trump had given the media the perfect angle, a narrative that would sell. He had turned their attention toward the one thing that could destroy the credibility of the judiciary itself, its own corruption. And now, the story had spiraled into a full-scale scandal, one that couldn't be contained or ignored. In one swift move, Trump had exposed a network of powerful, untouchable figures, all while staying in the shadows. The media was in chaos, scrambling to keep up with the developments, and the judges were now on the defensive. What Trump had done was simple, yet brilliant. He had turned the system against itself. As the days passed, the scandal reached new heights. The public was consumed by the revelations, and Trump's political rivals were scrambling. The opposition had underestimated the magnitude of his strategy. What they thought was a simple attempt to discredit the judiciary had morphed into a full-blown political crisis. Trump's critics were now on the defensive, forced to answer difficult questions about the very system they had long claimed was impartial and above reproach. Legal analysts began to weigh in, dissecting the damning evidence. The documents were authentic, the connections were irrefutable, and the corrupt judges could not hide their tracks. The more they denied it, the worse it looked. Their credibility was crumbling in real time. The public was losing trust in the very institutions that were meant to uphold justice. The media's frenzy didn't stop at the revelations. The networks went into overdrive, demanding investigations, and even calling for the impeachment of certain judges. Pundits debated the long-term impact on the judiciary, speculating on whether the damage could ever be repaired. The calls for reform grew louder with each passing hour, as Americans demanded accountability for those who had betrayed the public trust. Meanwhile, Trump's political team was masterfully navigating the chaos. While his opponents were trying to distance themselves from the scandal, Trump doubled down, positioning himself as the champion of justice. He framed himself as the one man willing to stand up against the corrupt system that had long been entrenched in power. He wasn't just exposing the corruption, he was positioning himself as the solution to a broken system. The legal cases against Trump, which had once seemed insurmountable, were now starting to lose steam. The very judges who had been presiding over his trials were now under suspicion. How could they rule impartially when their own integrity was being questioned? Trump's legal team began filing motions for recusal, citing the very conflict of interest that had once seemed so remote. The courts were now in turmoil, as judges recused themselves one by one, and new appointments had to be made. The legal battles against Trump were stalling, their momentum slowly unraveling in the wake of the scandal. Trump's enemies, those who had conspired to bring him down, were now caught in a web of their own making. The very system they had tried to manipulate for political gain was now spiraling out of control. The public was losing faith in the judges who had once seemed untouchable, and Trump had become the unexpected hero in this twisted saga. The genius of Trump's trap was now fully evident. He had not just exposed corruption, he had exploited it, turning it into a political weapon. His strategy had been bold, but it had worked. The judges were on the defensive, his legal battles were weakening, and his influence was stronger than ever. But the most remarkable part of this was yet to come. The trap, it seemed, was only half of his plan. As the scandal consumed the political landscape, Trump was preparing for his next move, one that would secure his legacy and complete his triumph. As the chaos of the judicial scandal reached its peak, Trump's political team began to move with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The battle for public opinion was shifting in his favor, and every day brought new developments that made his enemies appear more desperate and disorganized. The media frenzy had done its job. Trump was now positioned as the champion of reform, the man who had exposed the rot within the very system that was supposed to uphold justice. But Trump had something far more devious in mind. The exposure of the judges was not just a moment to bask in victory, it was a launching pad for his ultimate comeback. In an unexpected twist, Trump held a major press conference, but this time, he wasn't just responding to the media. He wasn't playing defense. Instead, he used the opportunity to unveil his next move, one that would cement his legacy and, in his mind, give him complete control of the narrative. His message was simple but devastating: I've spent years fighting corrupt people, corrupt systems. But now, it's time to fix the system for good. I'm running for president again, and this time, I'm bringing accountability to every corner of this country, especially the judicial system. The announcement hit like a thunderclap. The media, still caught in the aftermath of the judge scandal, suddenly had a new firestorm to cover: Trump's return to the political arena. His rivals scrambled to respond, but none of them had the political ammunition to fight back. The judges who had once been a powerful weapon against him were now liabilities, their credibility shattered by the scandal he had orchestrated. But Trump's move wasn't just about his campaign. He was positioning himself as the only figure capable of cleaning up the mess that had been created by the corrupt establishment. In his eyes, this wasn't just politics, it was a crusade to restore integrity to the nation. His announcement was followed by a flurry of legal maneuvers, with Trump filing motions to overhaul the judiciary entirely, proposing sweeping reforms that would remove any judge with questionable ties and ensure that only those with proven integrity could serve in high courts. The public's response was overwhelming. The scandal had opened a wound in the judicial system, and Trump was the one with the bandage. His campaign gained traction among those who were fed up with the status quo, and as Trump pushed his reform agenda, his support base solidified. His rivals were left floundering, unable to match his boldness or his messaging. And then came the final blow. In an unprecedented move, Trump's team managed to get an entire slate of federal judges dismissed for ethical violations related to the scandal. The groundwork for his judicial reforms had been laid with such precision that no one could argue against the necessity of the action. The narrative had been set, Trump had exposed the corruption, and now he was going to fix it. The corrupt judges, who had once been the gatekeepers of justice, were now powerless, stripped of their influence and tarnished beyond repair. Trump had turned their arrogance and misconduct into his stepping stone for a return to power. With his path cleared, his enemies left in disarray, and the judiciary in shambles, Trump's genius trap had worked. He had used the system's own corruption against it, weakened his opponents, and catapulted himself back into the political spotlight with unprecedented strength. In the end, the trap was simple: expose, destroy, and replace. Trump had not just played the game, he had rewritten the rules. The judges didn't see it coming. No one did. And as the dust settled, Trump stood victorious, his legacy forever altered by the scandal he had engineered with breathtaking brilliance. It wasn't over. Though Trump had achieved the immediate victory, his rivals left scrambling, the corrupt judges ousted, and the media still reeling from the shockwaves, the long-term implications of his strategy were just beginning to unfold. The story had shifted from scandal to solution, but the real work was just beginning for Trump and his political team. While the judges were still facing public backlash, Trump had planted a seed of doubt in the public's mind that would take root over time. His enemies, those who had tried to dismantle his career through legal means, were now facing an uphill battle of their own making. The judiciary, having been exposed as corrupt, was no longer seen as the neutral institution it once was. Public confidence had been shattered. No one trusted the system anymore, especially not after the depth of the corruption Trump had revealed. For Trump, this wasn't just a battle for the presidency, it was a war to reshape the nation's political landscape. He began assembling a new cadre of loyal allies, men and women who would replace the compromised judges. His reforms weren't limited to cleaning up the courts. The broader scope of his agenda, aimed at shaking up every level of government, was starting to take form. But Trump also knew that the chaos would only serve his ultimate goal if he could keep the pressure on. As the judicial system began to rebuild, so too would the political structures around it. He used his platform to rally his supporters, continuously framing the issues around one central theme: the fight for integrity. It wasn't about partisanship, it was about restoring power to the people. Every rally, every speech, every tweet was focused on rallying the masses to demand accountability, not just in the courts, but across the political spectrum. The backlash from his critics was fierce, but they had no unified response. The media continued to report on the scandal, but the lines between truth and conjecture had become blurred. Was Trump's entire operation a mere political ploy, or had he genuinely exposed something more sinister? The ambiguity worked in Trump's favor, leaving many unsure of what was true and what was simply an orchestrated narrative. And as his influence grew, so did his power. Key political figures who had once opposed him began to shift their stance, wary of the growing power of his base. Some even tried to cozy up to him, fearful of being left behind in the coming storm. The corruption he had so deftly exposed now made every politician vulnerable, even those who had once stood firm against him. In the midst of this turmoil, Trump's vision for reform began to take root. Legislative battles ensued, with bills being passed to institute a new system of judicial oversight, one that would make sure the kind of corruption he had uncovered would never happen again. But, as always, Trump played the long game, understanding that real change didn't come from just one victory, it came from years of persistent pressure, of building an empire, layer by layer. The opposition, though battered, was not finished. But Trump knew the game wasn't about winning every battle, it was about controlling the narrative and making sure his enemies couldn't unite against him. His final move was still on the horizon, the political revolution he had always dreamed of, a new America where the people, his people, could take back what had been stolen from them. But for now, the system was in disarray. His rivals were divided, the judiciary in chaos, and the nation's political foundation shifting beneath the feet of those who had once held power. Trump had become the kingmaker, the shadow over the country's every move. The genius trap had led him to this moment. And no one, not even his fiercest critics, could deny the truth: Trump had played the game, and he was winning. The smoke had cleared, but the storm wasn't over. Trump's victory in exposing the judiciary's corruption had fractured the political landscape, leaving a vacuum that was still in the process of filling. His enemies were scattered, retreating to their corners, but there was an underlying sense that something even bigger was coming. The long game, the true scope of Trump's plan, had yet to fully unfold. As the dust settled, Trump's focus turned inward. He knew that real power wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about consolidating control and pushing forward a vision that could reshape America. And that meant taking full advantage of the chaos he'd created. The political system, once firmly in the hands of the old guard, was now open for reformation. But even as Trump crafted his next moves, he had enemies still circling. The establishment, which had once treated him as a pariah, was now desperately trying to hold on to power. And those who had tried to destroy him in the courts, in the media, and on Capitol Hill, were not content to let him win this game unchecked. Behind the scenes, powerful figures began to quietly unite, former political adversaries, the remnants of the old guard, and even some in the media, plotting their counterattack. They knew they couldn't let Trump rewrite the rules. If they did, their power would be permanently undermined. But Trump was ready. His legal team, now bolstered by a new wave of young loyalists, had been strategically placing allies into key positions, securing the loyalty of state legislators, and preparing to roll out a series of political reforms that would fundamentally alter the system. His legal maneuvers had tied up his enemies in knots, and his supporters were fervently pushing for what they viewed as the restoration of justice. However, even with all the momentum on his side, Trump knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. A political revolution, one that could change the very nature of how America's government operated, wasn't something that could be accomplished overnight. Resistance would rise, and there would be more battles to fight, more scandals to weather. But Trump had always been a master of turning obstacles into opportunities. The press, still fixated on the judicial scandal, would serve as his megaphone. He had learned to turn the narrative, to control the news cycle, and to use the very institutions that had sought to undermine him to his advantage. The media, desperate for content, would keep fueling the fire, giving him the platform he needed to rally the people. In his speeches, he began to outline his vision for the future, an America where the will of the people came first, where corruption was eradicated, and where the elites were held accountable. He positioned himself as the only man who could restore the country's honor, its integrity, and its greatness. His words resonated with millions who were disillusioned with the system, with those who felt their voices had been drowned out by the establishment. But his enemies were not idle. They regrouped, trying to mount a counteroffensive, but there was no clear figurehead to oppose Trump. The division within the political establishment was wide. Even those who had opposed Trump from the start were now unsure how to proceed. The more they tried to attack him, the more they fed into his narrative, that the system was broken, that it was rigged against ordinary Americans. And Trump, ever the showman, leaned into the chaos. He stoked the fire, fueling public outrage at the injustices that had been exposed, while positioning himself as the solution to the problem. The storm before the calm was only a test of strength. The real battle for the soul of America, he knew, was about to begin in earnest. In the distance, the inevitable conflict between Trump's vision and the establishment's old guard was brewing. The final phase of his genius trap was at hand, one that would either crown him as the nation's ultimate reformer or mark the beginning of an epic political struggle. The storm was coming. And this time, Trump was prepared to ride it out. The air had thickened with anticipation. The storm that Trump had set in motion had now reached its crescendo. The old guard of Washington, fragmented and unsure of their next move, had no clear counter-strategy to Trump's overwhelming momentum. He had successfully manipulated the media, dismantled the judicial system, and positioned himself as the champion of the American people. His political empire was taking shape, one rally, one speech, and one reform after another. But as the final showdown loomed, Trump's opponents were beginning to rally under a banner of unity, knowing that their last hope lay in staving off his influence. Behind closed doors, the most powerful members of the establishment, old political dynasties, corporate elites, and even foreign interests, began to converge. They feared that if Trump succeeded in his reformation, it would fundamentally alter the political landscape in ways that could not be undone. Their power, their wealth, and their influence were all at risk. With the media still obsessed with the scandal, Trump knew that his next move would be decisive. He had to make it clear that the battle was no longer just about exposing corruption, it was about reshaping America's future. And this time, he would be moving faster than they could react. The political pressure was mounting, but Trump stood firm. His public speeches, delivered with the charisma and bravado that had made him a force to be reckoned with, called for sweeping changes. He wasn't just campaigning, he was calling for a revolution, a reorganization of the entire American system, a shift away from the entrenched elites and toward a government that truly represented the people. In Congress, debates raged. The remnants of the old establishment tried to block his reforms, but Trump's growing base of support, fueled by those who had once felt forgotten, forced many lawmakers to choose between their loyalty to the system or their loyalty to the people. As the reform bills made their way through the legislature, they met fierce opposition, but Trump supporters turned up the heat, protesting in the streets, rallying in town halls, and pushing for the changes they'd been promised. Then came the ultimate gambit. In a move that shocked both allies and enemies alike, Trump called for a nationwide referendum, a direct vote from the American people to decide on the most controversial reform of all, the complete overhaul of the judicial system. He proposed that judges, rather than being appointed by politicians, would now be elected by the people every 10 years. This, he claimed, would ensure that the judiciary remained accountable to the public, not to the entrenched power brokers. The media went into a frenzy. The very idea of electing judges was radical, unthinkable. Opponents screamed that it would undermine the independence of the courts, that it would lead to a politicized judiciary. But Trump, as always, turned the argument on its head. He argued that the current system had already politicized the courts. Look where it had led. It was time for change. The referendum day arrived, and the country was divided like never before. Voter turnout soared as Americans across the political spectrum went to the polls to have their say. Trump's supporters rallied behind the idea, believing that it would finally restore justice to the system. His opponents, however, warned of the chaos that could follow. The results came in. It was a landslide. Trump's reform passed with overwhelming support. The American people had spoken. They were ready for change, ready to dismantle the old system and replace it with something new. The corrupt judges, the political elites, the deep state, it was all in ruins. The system that had once worked to maintain the status quo was now a relic of the past. The storm had broken. The dust settled. And Trump stood victorious. In the days that followed, Trump moved swiftly to implement his reforms. A new generation of judges, elected by the people, began to replace the corrupt old guard. The judiciary was transformed into a more transparent, accountable system, one that was closely tied to the public will. The old Washington elites, their power eroded by the wave of change, could only watch as Trump solidified his place in history as the man who had reshaped the American political system. For Trump, it was the ultimate triumph. His genius trap had not only exposed the corruption in the system but had also used that very corruption to fuel his political revolution. He had taken down the establishment, restructured the judiciary, and built a political empire that would last for generations. The final victory was his, and the country would never be the same.